The edge is the cliff you've dangled from in 100 nightmares, Lisa Martinovic says. Yet her poem is titled, "The Edge is Where I Want to Be." Is she some kind of thrill seeker? Back on the plain and the trees, it is safe and comfortable, but you will get bored and stagnant, the poem suggests, if you never venture further out, if you never look over the edge of the cliff to find out what's there, much less jump off. Some people are drawn to literal edges: rock climbers, bungee jumpers, skydivers. Out on the edge, there's a feeling of exhilaration. You're going to go for it. Like roller coaster riders putting their arms up and screaming as they plunge down the great dive. Whatever else can be said about such an experience, it is not static. In the midst of it, you know you are alive. We are trying an experiment with worship for the next month or so, centering worship services around a common theme for a period of time. This will allow us to explore a variety of facets of the theme and dig deeper into the topic. Our theme this month? Risk. Today we consider what it means to be out on the edge, embracing risk in our individual lives. Amateur tightrope walker Catherine Rundle writes that just as long as there has been gravity, there has been the temptation to try, just for a moment, to get the better of it. She was inspired to learn to tightrope walk by men and women of the past who were famed for their daring walks, including crossing the gorge below Niagara Falls before that practice was banned. And like the famous Frenchman in Man on the Wire, who walked across a wire between the Twin Towers in New York in 1974. He stopped halfway across, knelt with his pole balanced on the wire, and hung a leg down into the vast open between the skyscrapers. Then, with his free hand, he saluted the birds. The thought of that salute, Rundle says, still makes me shake. I myself am generally a pretty risk-averse person when it comes at least to my physical safety and well-being. I doubt I'll ever hang glide, and I'm not sure I'd want to ride in a hot air balloon, although I admire them. But about a decade ago, I found myself uncharacteristically embracing a few such risks. I had been dating someone for 9 months. It was starting to get serious. And when 2 tickets to a Mexican resort vacation fell in my boyfriend's lap, I said yes to his invitation to go. We spent a lot of time hanging out on the beach and enjoying fresh fruit and Mexican hot chocolate at the resort. But we had a few adventures too. We poked around town and tried new foods. We rode out on a wave rider, which is kind of like a motorcycle in the ocean. We tried snorkeling. We also signed up for a backcountry Jeep jaunt to see sparkling waterfalls and the mountain forest. Both of us are leery of heights, by the way. As we took turn after sharp turn on winding mountain roads, our legs and all the other tourist legs dangling off the giant open-air Jeep over the edge of the mountain, my stomach doing butterflies, I started to wonder if this had been such a good idea. But when we stopped and hiked through the jungle, I got my bearings again. And then the trail emptied out at a crystal clear river, and the group waded out in swimsuits into the cold water flowing over a high cliff and downstream. Some young people had climbed up a rope ladder to a landing next to the waterfall and were taking turns swinging out over the cliff on a long rope, dropping down to plunge into the deeper pool where the waterfall poured over. I must have watched the jumpers for 20 or 30 minutes with curiosity and awe and aversion before something came over me. Maybe I had been living a bit too much in the uncooked vanilla pudding of life, as the poet put it. But I was here now, I mean, how often does one go to another country, drive through muddy mountain roads, and hike out into the jungle to a beautiful waterfall? If not now, when would I do such a thing as jump over a waterfall? So I did it. Twice. Truth be told, I don't remember the actual experience. But William, never without his camera, captured the moment in a series of burst shots, which you saw during the interlude. That was me. Something more internal also happened in Mexico. By the last day of the trip, I was gripped with the realization that this was a relationship worth risking something for, worth risking my heart and making a commitment. And about half a year later, we were married. That was the last picture I took on the trip. Saying yes to risks is saying yes to life. The question is, what risks do you want to take? What risks make life worthwhile? For almost everything worth doing involves some degree of risk. William Arthur Ward writes, "To laugh is to risk appearing the fool. To weep is to risk appearing sentimental. To reach out to another is to risk involvement. To expose feelings is to risk exposing your true self. To place your ideas and dreams before a crowd is to risk their loss. To love is to risk not being loved in return. To live is to risk dying. To hope is to risk despair. To try is to risk failure." There is no escaping risk, even in the most risk-averse life. We can assess the risks of any choice we are considering, but of course this is not a science. Someone who I think must have been burned said, "The risk I took was calculated, but man, am I bad at math." We may be able to find actuarial tables indicating the risk of driving a car or jumping out of a plane, but most of the risks of life, including the most important ones, cannot be gauged with such mathematical precision. Sometimes we just have to listen to the gut and go for it. I admire the risk taken by those who venture out to visit a new community, like Westside, not knowing for sure what they will find or how they will be received. It is not easy to put yourself out there in a new setting, or to come out as who you really are, when who you are challenges the social norms around you. Whether you are gay or bisexual, transgender or non-binary, or perhaps hang out with a bunch of religious liberals, but vote Republican sometimes. But closets are made for clothes, not people. So I appreciate the courage of those who come as they are or come out on the outside as they truly are on the inside. One has to weigh the risk of coming out and not being accepted against the risk of feeling out of sync with the true self. Scientists can now watch the brain making these kinds of assessments. One study found that our inclination toward risk or away from it varies a good deal from one individual to another, and it's pretty consistent over time. Some of us are born more enticed by heart-pounding experiences or mind-altering substances. Or more accurately, some of us are born naturally more fearful of risks like falling out of a roller coaster or losing control of ourselves. The brain study I read about supports the economic concept of loss aversion, that it's not so much that we gravitate toward the possibility of rewards, but rather that potential losses loom larger than gains in our minds. In other words, for most people, caution prevails. But every population also includes a smaller group of natural risk takers. And actually, in the article where I read about this in The Atlantic, it described a research program that was really geared toward helping the people who were too willing to take risks, gamblers and addicts. But what about the need to be more willing to take risks that may enhance our lives? What about the danger of falling into ruts in our relationships, our jobs, our creative lives? I suspect that rather than reining in our impulses, many of us need more help getting past the alarm bells of our fearful amygdalas and going for what we want, risks and all. Last spring, my family attended a family camp at U, the Unitarian Universalist Camp and Retreat Center in the Hill Country. There was to be a talent show on the final evening of the program. At one point, my child excitedly shared that she had been scared at the idea of performing, but then another kid at the camp had given her some tips on how to manage stage fright. When it came time for the talent show, although she still felt a bit shy, she agreed to join me in singing a duet. We would perform "You Are My Sunshine," complete with harmony. We practiced it several times apart from the crowd, and she reminded herself of the techniques she had learned for staying focused. Mostly, I think she was just encouraged that just because she felt some apprehension, that didn't mean that she couldn't do this exciting thing. So we sang our duet full-throated with smiles, and as the other families clapped in appreciation, a big grin spread over my 7-year-old's face. "That was fun," she said. She had gone out on the edge and had discovered that the edge was just where she wanted to be. Kids, it turns out, have a natural attraction to the edge. But parenting norms have changed in the past 40 to 50 years, and children are much more supervised than they once were. In an article titled "The Overprotected Kid," writer Hannah Rosen observes how differently it used to be when kids would play outside until supper time on school nights and throughout much of the weekend. I think the subtitle of the article sums it up pretty neatly. "A preoccupation with safety has stripped childhood of independence, risk-taking, and discovery without making it safer." Rosen writes that actions that would have been considered paranoid in the 70s, walking third graders to school, forbidding your kids to play ball in the street, going down the slide with the child in your lap, are now routine. In fact, they are markers of good, responsible parenting. She describes a trend toward adventure playgrounds, which hark back to an earlier era, providing kids more minimal supervision, greater engagement with the natural environment, and fostering more creative play. Other observers have noted how much less freedom to roam children have today. I'm reminded of the song from the rock group Queen that says something like, "I want to ride my bicycle. I want to ride my bike. I want to ride my bicycle. I want to ride it where I like." Of course, they said it in a very free-spirited way, but I want to ride my bicycle where I like. Kids don't do that like they used to. I think back to my own childhood when my brother and I biked freely in our neighborhood and beyond. We ran around playing kick the can with neighbor kids and did somersaults and other gymnastics in other people's backyards and jumped in piles of leaves and snow, called back in for supper from wherever we might be by the sound of a handbell that my parents would ring from the front porch. All the kids in our neighborhood knew that when they heard that bell, the Woodbury kids had to go home for supper. We weren't just in neighbors' front and backyards either. I grew up in a river town with steep bluffs, and right behind the block that my house was on, behind the alley, was a steep hill and another block with houses on it, and behind that, an even steeper hill that was heavily wooded. And we would go up there. There were homes that had little left of them, but basements, concrete basements and caving-in walls. We'd poke around and explore. I remember coming across interesting treasures like fancy colored glass bottles, which probably once held scotch from someone's liquor bar. We had all sorts of pretend adventures, And I don't recall any boo-boos that couldn't be handled by some hydrogen peroxide and a Band-Aid. The older kids helped the younger kids stay safe. My experience parallels the research findings, which Rosen cites from one early childhood education professor, Ellen Sandsetter. Children, she concludes, have a sensory need to taste danger and excitement. This doesn't mean that what they do has to actually be dangerous, only that they feel they are taking a great risk. That scares them, but then they overcome the fear. Children are born with this instinct to take risks in play, Sandsetter says, because historically, learning to negotiate risk has been crucial to survival. Even today, growing up is a process of managing fears and learning to arrive at sound decisions. Now, we might ask, what is gained by this direct experience with risk-taking? Sandsetter says that by engaging in risky play, children are effectively subjecting themselves to a form of exposure therapy in which they force themselves to do the thing they're afraid of in order to overcome their fear. But if they never go through that process, the fear can turn into a phobia. Paradoxically, Sandsetter writes, our fear of children being harmed, mostly in minor ways, may result in more fearful children and increased levels of psychopathology. So the upshot is we need to let our children learn to take calculated risks. One of my colleagues described such a calculated risk that her 7th grader decided to take recently. Her daughter texted her from school, asking if it was okay with her parents if she participated in a walkout at her school, one of many taking place at schools around the country, as students pressed the powers that be to take decisive action for their safety. The 12-year-old's mother texted back that it was okay with them if she made this choice out of conscience, but she would have to accept whatever consequences the school gave to the protesters. They fully supported her in taking this risk for the greater good. And by the way, for every real person whose story I share today, whether directly or by allusion, I do have their blessing to share it with you. Now, as it turns out, at this particular school, the school was fully supportive of the walkout. Perhaps school leaders were inspired by the students' own principled risk-taking. Parents received a school communication stating that staff had worked to keep students safe during the walkout, and after their return, had gathered up students' expressions of sympathy and support for the students in Florida, sending the notes there as a show of solidarity. People of all ages in this school were willing to take some measured risk in their own lives in order to help reduce the risk of future tragedies like those in Florida. Risk is not always life and death, though. I love the children's story that we heard, in which the child embraces his creative voice, happy with pictures and poems that are sun-ish or peace-ish, works that capture a feeling or idea more than the precise, literal details of life. Although the literal details of life, artistically rendered, can also carry quite a punch. Recently, I met with a friend at the Modern Art Museum for lunch, and afterwards we stopped in at the new sculpture exhibit by Ron Muke. I will never look at human flesh the same way again. Muke's sculptures are so lifelike, with subtle variations in the color palette of the skin, fine lines, freckles and moles, veins, hair. Figures are scaled small or huge, draw the eye even more. An exhausted mother with a newborn secured on her chest and a grocery bag hanging from her hand is more diminutive than a real person, adding to the sympathetic response that I felt as I was looking at her. And the tenderness of an aging couple on the beach, leaning into each other, was all the more poignant because of their giant size. The artist knows something about risk and is not afraid to take on more controversial subjects as well. One piece at the Modern is a giant chicken carcass, The creative risks he took shook me out of my own head and the trap of being stuck inside my own body. I was sick at the time, so this was particularly welcome. I want to leave you today with this question. What risks do you want to take in your own life? What edge promises to help you come alive, fully alive? Maybe you need to quit a job, take a class, start a new hobby, or go for that promotion. Perhaps the promise of risk lies in your relationships. Is it time to end a relationship which has no life left in it? Or to reach out to someone who might become a new friend? To tell that sibling or coworker to back off when they have crossed a line? Or maybe to try some new things with your partner. Go dancing or cook some new dishes in order to create more aliveness in your shared life. Could it be that the risks of leadership or activism are calling to you the opportunity to make a real difference? Going out on the edge, saying yes to risk, is saying yes to life. Therefore, let us choose well the risks that we take. May it be so. Amen.